Hercule Poirot is drawn into a puzzling case when a single street lamp in a quiet city square begins to flicker each night at the exact same hour. Beneath its failing light, a man vanishes without a trace, leaving only whispers of conspiracy. To uncover the truth, Poirot must follow the shadows the lamp reveals and the secrets it was meant to hide. Chapter 1: The Flicker Before the Folie began, as many of Poirot's strangest cases did. Not in the drawing room of a stately manor or the hushed corridors of a luxury liner, but rather on a nondescript street in Chelsea-Ford Crescent, to be precise. A quiet cul-de-sac of tall Georgian townhouses, where the ivy grew obediently and postmen walked with the calm confidence of routine. Yet on the night in question, a single flickering street lamp at the corner outside No. 17 turned the ordinary into something subtly askew. The flicker began just after 11 o'clock. It was a strange kind of flicker, not the erratic sputter of a faulty bulb, but a deliberate rhythm. On for 3 seconds, off for 2, on, off, like Morse code in light dot, and then came the scream, not a shriek of terror, but a choked gasp, a gasp that seemed almost interrupted, cut short mid-breath. It was heard by two people: Miss Virginia Appleby, a retired Latin teacher who lived at No. 14 and maintained the firm belief that most modern crimes stem from bad syntax, and Sergeant Leonard Fellows, off duty and just returning from the local pub, fumbling with his key at No. to 1. Both turned instinctively toward No. 17. The house belonged to Mr. Julian de Vries, a well-known art restorer with a reputation for discretion and a clientele list that whispered with nobility. He was a man of immaculate taste, known for his gardenias, monogrammed handkerchiefs, and preference for silence. He lived alone, save for a live-in housekeeper, Mrs. Lillian Greaves, and occasional visits from his much younger half-sister, Estelle. Sergeant Fellows, sobering rapidly, raced up the stone steps of No. 17 and rang the bell. No answer. He knocked hard. Still no answer. That flickering light continued outside like an uneasy heartbeat. He would later recount the decision as instinctual. He stepped back, checked the narrow garden path along the side of the house, found the kitchen door slightly ajar and entered. Within moments, he stumbled upon Mrs. Greaves in the corridor, wide-eyed and whispering, "It's Mr. de Vries. He's on the floor." In the study, indeed, Julian de Vries lay sprawled across the polished parquet, an upturned chair beside him, a record still spinning silently on the gramophone. A half-finished glass of cognac sat precariously on the desk, next to an open ledger and a brass letter opener, though it was not that tidy instrument that had ended his life. He had been strangled with deliberate, clinical force. And strangely and cannily there was not a single sign of struggle. The room was immaculate. The only other peculiar detail was the angle of his head, tilted just slightly toward the window, as if he had turned his face toward that flickering light. By morning, Ford Crescent was sealed with police tape and curiosity. Reporters lingered at the far end, craning for glimpses and quotes. Superintendent Jarvis of Scotland Yard had already been summoned, and now stood grim-faced in the study of No. 17, peering at the corpse with an air of weary distaste. "It doesn't add up," he muttered. Dr. Lionel Sadler, the local coroner, adjusted his spectacles. "Dead at approximately 11, by my guess." He wasn't surprised. Look at the position, still seated when the attack began. Someone he knew, trusted. Jarvis nodded absently, then turned toward the door as it opened. A small, dapper figure entered with unmistakable poise, as if the crime scene were a dinner party he had been fashionably late to. Hercule Poirot, not summoned, but not unwelcome either. "Mon ami," Poirot greeted Jarvis with a subtle bow. "I read of the incident in the early edition, and, by happy coincidence, I am visiting a dear friend only 2 streets away." You'll forgive, I hope, the curiosity of an old man who dislikes loose ends. Jarvis raised an eyebrow. Loose ends. We've barely begun. Precisely why they are already unraveling, Poirot said with a faint smile. But perhaps I am premature. Permit me merely to observe, yes? Jarvis relented. Be my guest, Monsieur Poirot, though I suspect this one may be beneath your talents. The motive, I dare say, will soon be obvious. De Vries dealt with rare art. Those ledgers of his may hold the answer. Poirot approached the desk, his eyes not on the ledgers, but the glass of cognac, then the window, then the gramophone. Perhaps, he murmured, or perhaps it is not the work that holds the answer, but the flicker. Jarvis frowned. Flicker. Poirot stepped to the window. The street lamp outside remained steady in daylight, innocent in appearance. Last night, Poirot said, tapping the glass gently, it flickered, in perfect rhythm, like a metronome, or a signal. He turned slowly. Tell me, Superintendent, was this murder committed at 11 o'clock? Or was it performed for 11 o'clock? There's a difference, I think, yes? Outside, Miss Appleby watched from her parlor, knitting halted mid-row. Across the street, Estelle de Vries arrived in a navy coat and trembling in silence. Inside, the truth waited quiet, masked, precise. Just like the killer. Chapter to the first close study of Julian de Vries remained undisturbed. A room seemingly rested in the exact moment between civility and silence. Sunlight filtered in softly through the tall windows, casting a warm glow on the polished wood paneling, the antique bookcases, the heavy curtains drawn back with braided cords. And yet the body, now removed, had left a quiet hollowness like a missing piece from a symmetrical painting. Poirot moved with slow deliberation, his gloved hands never idle, his gaze noting what others had already overlooked. There's always a story a room tells, he murmured. The question is whether it tells the truth, or what it has been instructed to say. Jarvis sighed from the doorway. And what, precisely, is this room saying to you, Monsieur Poirot? Poirot turned. That someone has been clever, perhaps too clever. It is too harmonious. A murder by strangulation, but no signs of struggle. A man of refinement, who drinks cognac in moderation, listens to classical records killed with clinical force, and yet not a paper out of place. No broken glass, no defensive bruises. It is as if Monsieur de Vries simply ceased. Dr. Sadler, still tidying his bag, interjected. There were faint contusions on the neck, not consistent with garrote wire or rope hands, I think. Strong ones, possibly gloved. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, and what of the glass? He gestured to the untouched cognac. Sadler raised a brow. Clean, no signs of poison. Jarvis, growing impatient, moved to the ledger left open on the desk. Well, if you ask me, this points to business. Take a look at these names, Poirot. Aristocrats, foreign collectors, even a Russian count. De Vries dealt in things worth more than houses. You restore an unsigned Caravaggio for the right client, and suddenly secrets have value. Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, you think the motive lies in forgery, extortion, perhaps the mishandling of a priceless work, or blackmail, Jarvis said. An art restorer who knows the truth about authenticity is a man worth silencing. Poirot said nothing. Instead, he turned his attention to a curious detail. Along the edge of the bookshelf, barely visible, was a faint scuff mark horizontal, low to the ground. Mon Dieu, he said softly, crouching. Jarvis, do you see this? Something was moved. A cabinet, perhaps, a box, and look, scratches on the floor, minute, but fresh. Do you permit me to move it? Jarvis gave a grunt of assent. Poirot carefully shifted the lower shelf's contents aside and discovered a small, narrow compartment built into the lower frame, cleverly concealed behind the molding. Empty. Ah, he said. Not just tidy. Too tidy. Think the killer took something? asked Jarvis, now genuinely interested. "I think," said Poirot, standing. "The killer knew what he wanted, and he came with the intention of finding it. This is no crime of passion." Jarvis ran a hand through his graying hair. "So we've a murder, a concealed compartment emptied. A flickering street lamp, you claim, is no coincidence. And a housekeeper who swears she heard nothing until the police arrive." "Precisely," said Poirot, his expression tightening. They moved to the hall, where Mrs. Greaves was seated stiffly on a small wooden chair near the stairs, her hands folded like pressed linen in her lap. Poirot approached gently. "Madam, forgive the intrusion. You were in the kitchen last night, yes?" She nodded quickly. "Preparing a pot of tea. Mr. de Vries often asked for one late. It calmed his nerves, and you heard nothing? No voices, no raised tones, just a sort of thump. I thought he had dropped something." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "And yet you did not check?" Mrs. Greaves flushed. "I was boiling water, and it wasn't alarming. Not like a fall, more like a chair being pushed back." Poirot leaned closer, speaking softly. "And was anyone else in the house yesterday evening?" The housekeeper hesitated. "Miss Estelle came for supper around 8. She left by 10. Mr. de Vries asked not to be disturbed after that." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "And did she seem well?" "She always seems strained. Not rude, but nervous. You know the type. Lovely girl, but something brittle behind the eyes." "Merci," Poirot said, rising. Jarvis motioned him aside. "What do you make of her? Suspicious?" Poirot shook his head. No, not yet. Everyone in a murder investigation is suspicious until proven otherwise, even the cat. But you will notice Madame Greaves did not mention Estelle twice. Not until prompted. Curious omission. And the flickering lamp?" Jarvis asked again. "You really think it means something?" Poirot turned toward the window once more. "You are a practical man, mon ami. Consider this. The lamp flickered in a pattern. Not random, not faulty. 5 seconds, off, on, off or on. A code, perhaps, or a signal to someone watching. Watching from where?" Poirot said nothing, only pointed toward the neighboring house No. 15 Mitford Crescent. The curtains on the upper floor moved ever so slightly, as if someone had just stepped back into the shadows. "Time to meet the neighbors," Poirot said calmly. And with that, he buttoned his coat and stepped into the growing intrigue that hummed just beneath Mitford Crescent's prime façade. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. Number 15 Mitford Crescent was the sort of home that gave the illusion of silence, but never quite achieved it. Heavy drapes, dark wooden furniture, and grandfather clocks whose ticking seemed more accusatory than comforting. It belonged to Lady Eugenia Willoughby, a woman in her late 60s whose manner had the stiffness of a pressed lace collar. Once a celebrated stage actress, she had retired when her husband passed, retreating into an austere solitude surrounded by portraits, dusty playbills, and a set of opera glasses she still clutched like a relic of better days. She greeted Poirot and Superintendent Jarvis with a half-performed curtsy and a sharp eye. "Of course I noticed the flickering," she said, settling into a high-backed armchair as Poirot took a seat across from her. "It was entirely unnatural. I told Elsie to call the council and report it. She forgot, of course. Useless girl. But I saw it. The pattern was unsettling." Jarvis frowned. "Did you notice anyone at Mr. de Vries' home that evening?" Lady Eugenia hesitated. "Not clearly. The curtains were mostly drawn, but there was a figure, just after 10, standing by the window, I think, or perhaps on the steps. A man, tall, in a long coat, or a woman with very broad shoulders. The light flickered, then they were gone." Poirot pressed gently. "And you did not think to notify the authorities when the scream followed?" "I did not hear a scream, Monsieur Poirot, but I am somewhat hard of hearing, especially in my right ear. I only noticed something was wrong when the constable began knocking. By then, the lamp had stopped flickering. She paused, then added with a tight smile, "You think the lamp was a signal, don't you? Clever, a sort of Morse, yes?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "A possibility, madam. And you are not unfamiliar with the stage, no. The flickering of a single spotlight can mean much to those who understand its timing." Lady Eugenia allowed herself the shadow of a smirk. In the theater, a flicker could cue a change in lighting, or signal the curtain. A silent command, Poirot echoed softly. "'Twas by noon, all occupants of Montford Crescent had been assembled at No. 17, in the very parlor where Julian de Vries had once entertained patrons and scholars. Now it served as a stage for interrogation and observation. Poirot surveyed them like a chessboard. Miss Estelle de Vries, 26, pale and angular, sat with her hands tightly clasped in her lap. Her dark hair was pulled back in a careful bun. Her grief seemed genuine, but there was a distance in her eyes as though her mourning were internalized behind layers of practiced detachment. Mrs. Lillian Greaves, the housekeeper, stood stiffly by the fireplace, her apron crisply folded. She had the look of someone who resented being watched, and resented even more the guilt of those who deserved to be. Anthony Wynne, a neighboring lodger from No. 13, had also been called in. He was a lean, weary man in his 40s, a rare books dealer whose long fingers drummed on his knees with impatience. He claimed to have been out on business the night before, but gave no precise details. Virginia Appleby, from No. 14, had arrived in her best hat and worst mood, clutching a notebook of theories. "I'm certain it's someone within our little circle," she said to Poirot. "It always is, isn't it? In Latin, we say intra muros, intra crimen, within the walls, within the crime." Poirot smiled politely and turned his attention to the final guest. Dr. Felix Roth, a neurologist who resided at No. 19, had arrived late, apologizing profusely. A tall man with thinning hair and rimless glasses. He had a habit of glancing sideways when questioned, a trait Poirot tucked away with interest. Jarvis addressed the room. "Let us be clear. Mr. de Vries was murdered. He was strangled with bare hands, and we believe the killer either stole something or removed an incriminating item from a hidden compartment in his study." At this, Estelle de Vries looked up sharply. "A compartment? My brother never mentioned, but he would not have, mademoiselle," Poirot interrupted gently. "Secrets, by their very nature, are not shared." He stepped to the center of the room. "Each of you had a relationship with Monsieur de Vries, and each of you had an opportunity. That is undeniable. What we now examine is motive. Julian had no enemies," Estelle said quietly. "He disliked confrontation." Poirot inclined his head. "Even the gentlest river can drown a man, mademoiselle. Might I ask, did your brother ever confide in you anything of value gone missing? Or a fear, perhaps?" She hesitated. He seemed preoccupied lately, restless. He mentioned being watched, though I assumed it was just a sense of unease. He never elaborated. "Watched?" Jarvis echoed. "By whom?" "I don't know. He said he felt it most at night, that someone was outside." Poirot glanced toward the window, then back to Estelle. "Then we must assume, mademoiselle, that your brother feared something, or someone. And last night, they came." The room fell still. Poirot straightened his cuffs. "I shall begin my inquiries tomorrow, one by one. Until then, I ask that no one leave Montford Crescent without notifying the police." Anthony Wynne rose. "Are we suspects then?" "Everyone is a suspect," Poirot said, with a slight smile. "Even me. Though I have an alibi." He turned to leave, then paused. "And Madame Appleby, if you would be so kind, bring your Latin notebook tomorrow. Sometimes ancient words reveal modern truths." As the guests began to depart, Poirot remained by the door. Watching. Not who left first, but who hesitated last. Chapter 4. Poirot observest following morning. Montford Crescent woke to a silence more deliberate than peaceful. A fog had rolled in off the Thames, dimming the street into a dreamlike haze. The street lamp outside No. 17 now stable, now ordinary, stood like a mute sentinel to a secret no longer its own. Inside the De Vries home, Poirot took his breakfast alone in the conservatory, with a small porcelain teacup in hand and a plate of precisely sliced brioche before him. He ate with delicate discipline, but his eyes were not on the food. They wandered the garden beyond the glass, gravel undisturbed, footprints leading only to the side entrance, none crossing the flower beds. He had requested no one disturb the property until his investigation was fully underway. When Superintendent Jarvis arrived just after 9, Poirot was already in the study again, this time examining the record that had been left spinning on the gramophone the night of the murder. Brahms, a quiet, melancholic piano intermezzo. It was still cued to repeat. Sentimental, Jarvis muttered, stepping inside and removing his gloves. So, are we any closer to knowing who throttled your art restorer? Poirot gestured to the gramophone. You know what I find curious, mon ami? This, it was left spinning when Mr. De Vries was found, yes? That's what the housekeeper said. She found the record turning, but it had been set to a loop. That is not accidental. This is not a radio. It must be done deliberately. Mr. De Vries was playing this piece over and over. For comfort? For meaning? Or as cover for another sound? Jarvis blinked. You think he was expecting someone? Poirot nodded slowly. Or something. Music, you see, masks time. It creates a rhythm of its own. If one were anticipating a precise moment, say, a signal, this would serve to pass the minutes in equal measure. He turned and met Jarvis's gaze directly. And then there is the lamp. The flicker came not randomly, but in sequence. We must consider it a signal now. It was witnessed by at least 3 people, all of whom describe it with uncanny consistency. Jarvis rubbed his chin. So De Vries is in here, playing Brahms, waiting for a signal that comes from the street lamp. Then what? He lets someone in? Someone he knows? Poirot said. He lets them in. He does not fear them, perhaps even expect them. And then he dies. There was a long pause as the record ticked softly in the silence. Jarvis broke it. And the daughter, Miss Estelle. What do you make of her? Poirot tilted his head. Half-sister, not daughter. But she is intriguing. She mourns without protest. Her grief is neat, like her posture. It is not that she pretends, no, but she conceals. I wish to know what she conceals. And Lady Eugenia. Ah, Poirot said with a knowing smile. Lady Eugenia sees everything, but she speaks only in fragments, like a retired performer offering commentary on a play she no longer stars in. Her story interests me, though she may not know she is telling one. At 11 o'clock sharp, Poirot began his rounds. His first stop was No. 13 Anthony Wynn's residence. The man answered the door still in his dressing gown, eyes bleary. Detective Poirot, of course. You'll want to talk, I suppose? Poirot entered with polite grace and was ushered into a cluttered sitting room filled with books and auction catalogues. You deal in rare editions, yes? First folios, illuminated manuscripts, the odd band memoir. Discretion is part of the business. But may I? Reluctantly, Wynne nodded. Poirot scanned the top envelope. Addressed to Wynne, no return label. Handwritten in a slanted script. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. You were out the night of the murder? Cambridge, Wynne said too quickly. Dinner with a collector. I returned late, alone. Wynne stiffened. Yes, Poirot's expression was unreadable. You know, Mr. Wynne, what I find interesting. You did not ask how Mr. De Vries was killed. Most people do. Wynne gave a thin smile. Because I already know. Everyone on the Crescent does by now, don't they? Ah, said Poirot. but everyone claims not to. He stood. Merci, monsieur. I will not detain you further. As he stepped back onto the crescent, Poirot noticed something peculiar from Anthony Wynn's doorway. One had a perfect line of sight to the street lamp, not from the window, from the stoop, a narrow corridor of vision but unbroken. He made a note. By the time Poirot returned to No. 17, Estelle de Vries had arrived for her scheduled interview. She stood in the entry hall, clutching a handbag so tightly her knuckles were white. "I've remembered something," she said as he entered. "Something strange, please, mademoiselle. Speak freely." "I returned that evening," she said, voice low. "Around 10:30. I told Mrs. Greaves I'd left a bracelet in the guest room and didn't want to wake Julian in the morning. And did you retrieve it?" "I did," she said. "But on my way down, I saw the window." "But may I?" Reluctantly, Wynn nodded. Poirot scanned the top envelope. Addressed to Wynn, no return label. Handwritten in a slanted script. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "You were out the night of the murder?" "Cambridge," Wynn said too quickly. "Dinner with a collector. I returned late, alone." Wynn stiffened. "Yes." Poirot's expression was unreadable. "You know, Mr. Wynn, what I find interesting. You did not ask how Mr. de Vries was killed. Most people do." Wynn gave a thin smile. "Because I already know. Everyone on the Crescent does by now, don't they?" "Ah," said Poirot, "but everyone claims not to." He stood. "Merci, monsieur. I will not detain you further." As he stepped back onto the Crescent, Poirot noticed something peculiar from Anthony Wynn's doorway. One had a perfect line of sight to the street lamp, not from the window, from the stoop, a narrow corridor of vision but unbroken. He made a note. By the time Poirot returned to No. 17, Estelle de Vries had arrived for her scheduled interview. She stood in the entry hall, clutching a handbag so tightly her knuckles were white. "I've remembered something," she said as he entered. "Something strange, please, mademoiselle. Speak freely." "I returned that evening," she said, voice low. "Around 10:30. I told Mrs. Greaves I'd left a bracelet in the guest room and didn't want to wake Julian in the morning. And did you retrieve it?" "I did," she said. "But on my way down, I saw the window in the study was open. Julian never opened that window. And I could have sworn I saw someone standing across the street, watching." Poirot's brow furrowed. "And you told no one?" "I didn't think it mattered," she whispered. "But now," Poirot said gently, "you realize the eyes that watched may not have watched you." "Mademoiselle, but him." He offered her a chair outside. The street lamp stood still and cold, but the rhythm, Poirot thought, had already begun again. Chapter 5. Initial interviews began. Hercule Poirot had always believed that the human face like a room told a story, but unlike a room, it could not be dusted for fingerprints. Instead, it revealed itself in hesitation, contradiction, the minute flicker of emotion behind a statement. So when he resumed his interviews later that afternoon, in the drawing room of No. 17 Montford Crescent, he was less interested in what was said than in how it was said and what was not. His first guest was Miss Estelle de Vries. She sat upright, her hands folded in her lap, a single silver bracelet glinting against her pale skin. She had exchanged her navy coat for a modest beige dress, plain but elegant, with a thin belt that emphasized her delicate frame. "I have told you all I know," she said softly. "I left by 10. I returned briefly to collect my bracelet and saw the open window, and possibly someone watching." "You say possibly," Poirot said. "Yet your eyes suggest certainty." She hesitated. "Perhaps I did not want to believe it. That someone was watching my brother. That he was afraid." "Why afraid?" She looked down. He had been nervous lately, distracted. He would check the locks twice, keep the curtains drawn. He even refused to discuss a particular client, something about a recent commission that had gone. Strange in what way? I don't know, she said. He wouldn't tell me, only that it was delicate and not to be spoken of on the telephone. Poirot tapped a finger against his lips. And this bracelet you returned to collect, may I see it? She extended her wrist. Ah, he said. Silver, not expensive, but old. Sentimental? My mother's, Estelle replied. Poirot gave a slight nod. I thank you, mademoiselle. That will be all for now. Next came Mrs. Lillian Greaves, who entered the room with the calm, weathered composure of a woman used to tragedies not her own. She perched stiffly on the edge of the armchair, her hands firmly on her knees. You have worked for Monsieur de Vries for how long? Poirot asked. 8 years, she said. He was a good man. Demanding, yes, but never cruel. He trusted very few people. I like to think I was one. And yet you heard nothing on the night he died. She stiffened. I told the police I was in the kitchen. I heard the record playing, then a thud as if a chair had been moved. Nothing violent, no voices, no raised tones. No, sir. It was unusually quiet. Poirot studied her. And yet you did not check on him? She flushed. It wasn't unusual for him to spend long hours alone. He was particular about privacy. I would have thought it intrusive. He nodded slightly. Tell me, madam, had he received any visitors in the days before his death? Only Miss Estelle. And the postman. And that man from No. 13, Mr. Wynne. He dropped something off. A wrapped parcel, I believe. Books? I assumed so. Poirot made a mental note. And did Mr. de Vries receive any unusual phone calls? She paused. There was one 2 nights before. He hung up immediately after answering. Said nothing. Then locked the study door for the evening. Ah, Poirot said. One final question. Did you dust the study yesterday? She looked affronted. Of course not. I was told the police wished the room was left untouched. Poirot smiled gently. Then it is good you obeyed. Anthony Wynne arrived next, sharper dressed than before in a houndstooth blazer and polished shoes. His manner had shifted, less flippant now, more defensive. You're wasting time, he said, settling into the armchair with a sigh. This was a theft, pure and simple. Someone wanted something de Vries had. I suggest you look into his clients, especially the foreign ones. Indeed, monsieur. Poirot said mildly. You are yourself in the business of rarities, no? Yes, but books are easier to trace. Paintings, documents, that's where the real danger lies. You delivered a parcel recently to Mr. de Vries, did you not? Wynne blinked. Yes, a bound volume for restoration. A private client. May I ask the name? Wynne hesitated. I'd prefer not to say. Confidentiality. Poirot's smile did not change. Of course, but let me pose a hypothetical. Suppose a man knew that a valuable item had passed through Mr. de Vries' hands, an item that was never supposed to surface. That man might have a reason to kill, no. Wynne looked away. You're making a great many assumptions. I make no assumptions, said Poirot. Only observations. His final visitor of the day was Lady Eugenia Willoughby. She entered with theatrical grace, as if stepping onto a stage. Her perfume lingered in the air like a memory, and her eyes sparkled with something not quite amusing. You see, Monsieur Poirot, this house has always been too quiet, far too quiet for my tastes. I warned Julien that solitude invites shadows. You knew Mr. de Vries well? We had a cordial rapport. He appreciated beauty. I appreciated his discretion. I once loaned him a miniature portrait 18th century. He restored it with a surgeon's hand. And you have your own theories, madam? Oh yes, she said, folding her hands. This murder was not about money. It was about silence. And whatever was taken from that hidden compartment, I'd wager it was not a painting. No, it was a secret. A secret wrapped in paper. Poirot leaned forward slightly. And what makes you think it was wrapped? Lady Eugenia smiled. Because there was no trace left. Only a man who died staring toward the light. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the fog-shrouded rooftops, Poirot returned to the study. He stood once more before the tall window, looking out toward the street lamp. "Everyone has noticed it," he whispered. "Everyone understands what it could mean. But only one person needed it." He folded his hands behind his back. "One by one, the masks will fall." Chapter 6. The first false lead next morning brought with it a burst of unexpected clarity. Or so Superintendent Jarvis believed. At precisely 10 o'clock, the postman who serviced Mitford Crescent arrived at the local police station, agitated and breathless, a crumpled envelope clutched in his hand. Within minutes, Jarvis was on the phone to Poirot. "I think we found your motive," Jarvis said. "And your killer." Poirot, though intrigued, offered only a cautious hum. "Ah, do tell, mon ami." "A letter, posted anonymously and never delivered. It slipped into the outgoing mail bag, unaddressed. But the postman found it this morning. It must have been tucked between two larger parcels. It names Julian de Vries as a blackmailer." Poirot's brows lifted. "Blackmail? The letter claims he was using his "I don't know." Poirot spoke softly, but his tone carried weight. "You were observed standing at your doorway the night of the murder. From there, you could see the flickering lamp." Wynn's jaw tensed. "So could half the Crescent." "Yes," Poirot said, "but only a few had cause to recognize it as a signal." Jarvis pressed harder. "You had a connection to the victim, a motive if he was blackmailing you, and the opportunity." "I didn't kill him," Wynn said flatly. "And if I was being blackmailed, I'd hardly report it, would I?" Poirot tilted his head. "Ah, but someone knew. Someone who wanted to ensure the manuscript disappeared forever. The hidden compartment was empty when we found it. What better way to silence both the forger and the forgery?" Wynn exhaled sharply. "I didn't write the letter. I didn't kill Julian." "You are a clever man," Poirot said. "But cleverness alone does not shield one from guilt or innocence." That afternoon, Poirot and Jarvis returned to No. 17. The house felt colder now, as if the tension of the previous day had not lifted, but deepened. "I'm still not sure he's not involved," Jarvis muttered. "Too much alignment." Poirot agreed. "Too much aligns. Too quickly." He led the superintendent to the study and gestured to the desk. "The letter. What strikes you about it?" "Anonymous, typed, slipped into the mail." Poirot nodded. "And precisely what a guilty man would not do because it draws attention." Jarvis frowned. "You think he's being framed?" Poirot stepped to the window. "Not framed, redirected. Someone wishes us to see Wynn as guilty. That someone knows we would discover the forged manuscript. They planted the seed." Jarvis folded his arms. "So the real killer sent the letter, or intercepted it, or copied it. But the possibility is strong." He turned. "And consider Wynn claimed he never picked up the manuscript. But the compartment is empty. That means someone retrieved it, Wynn himself, or someone who knew it existed." Jarvis looked puzzled. "But that could be Estelle, Mrs. Greaves, or even Lady Eugenia. All had access. All had an opportunity. But motive? That is the elusive thread." Poirot walked slowly to the bookshelf. "I once said, Jarvis, that a room tells a story. But sometimes that story has an unreliable narrator." He pulled out a slim volume of poetry. Inside was a folded slip of paper, yellowed, faintly crinkled. He handed it to Jarvis. Jarvis read it aloud. "Item received. Payment pending. Do not speak further. We are being watched. No signature." Poirot nodded. It was tucked in between Yeats and Shelley. Poets, yes, but both obsessed with visions, the unseen, the mystical. A subtle hiding place. Jarvis stared at the note. Blackmail, or a warning? A partnership gone sour. De Vries was involved in something secretive, but I believe he tried to pull away. Jarvis tucked the note into an evidence bag. "So we start again?" Poirot gave a slight smile. We continue, but we look not for what is obvious but for what is missing. He walked to the window once more and looked out toward the street lamp, now still and lifeless under the afternoon sky. Last night, he murmured, the lamp flickered. Tonight, let us see who waits for it again. Chapter 7. The Psychological Gamut at Evening. The air around Montford Crescent hung heavy, draped in the kind of hush that precedes revelation or another mistake. The street lamp outside number 17, newly repaired, stood tall and still. Yet it was not the bulb that Poirot watched for signs of life, it was the people. From the drawing room of number 15, a house graciously lent by the widowed Mrs. Dalloway for observation purposes, Poirot stood behind a sheer curtain, his keen eyes alert. Beside him, Superintendent Jarvis nursed a cup of lukewarm tea, glancing often at his pocket watch. No movement yet, Jarvis muttered. Poirot gave a faint nod, not looking away from the street. None, not yet. But they will come. Curiosity is a vice easily disguised as concern. Jarvis arched an eyebrow. You believe someone will return to the scene of the crime? I believe, Poirot said softly, that someone is watching. They watched when the signal flickered. They watched when the police arrived. And they may well have watched us discover the hidden compartment. They are clever, yes, but nerves, Superintendent. Nerves reveal what caution cannot hide. As the last of the sunlight dissolved into the velvet blue of evening, subtle changes emerged on the crescent from number 21. Lady Eugenia Clarendon stepped out onto her front stoop under the pretense of a walk, shawl around her shoulders, her eyes wandering but always drifting back to number 17. At number 19, the curtains shifted once, then again. A silhouette appeared, briefly framed in the yellow light of the window. Estelle. Jarvis spotted her and gestured. She's watching us. No, Poirot said. She's watching the lamp. Just before 9, the street lamp flickered once. Poirot straightened. Regardez, Jarvis squinted at the post. It's just settling. Surely no, that was deliberate. It is the bait. He crossed to the other window, where the alley behind number 17 was partially visible through ivy-covered walls. There, he whispered. A figure shadowed, but swift slipped out the rear garden gate of number 17, cut across the alley, and vanished into the hedge bordering the public square. Jarvis reached for his coat. We'll follow. No, Poirot said calmly. We wait. The superintendent blinked. Wait, they're getting away. Let them go, for now. This is not the endgame, it is the rehearsal. We must understand their choreography before we interrupt their performance. The next morning, Poirot requested each of the principal neighbors to attend a meeting at number 17, under the pretext of clarifying key statements for the final inquest, though none were legally compelled to comply. Curiosity and social pressure did the work of summons. By 10:30, the drawing room of the late Julian de Vries once again became a stage, this time, with Poirot as its conductor. Estelle Whitcomb arrived first, unusually composed, dressed in charcoal gray. She carried a leather folio under her arm. Then came Anthony Wynne, still pale from his previous interrogation, but firm in his denials. Lady Eugenia followed last, face powdered, lips set, her walking stick thudding pointedly against the wooden floor. Poirot stood before the mantel, the others arranged before him in a loose semicircle. Jarvis sat near the door, notepad in hand. Amos, Poirot began. Thank you for indulging me. I ask only a few moments more of your time and patience. We are very close to understanding what happened here. But to do so, I must return briefly to the matter of why. Estelle shifted slightly in her chair. Poirot turned toward her. Miss Whitcomb, you and Julian de Vries were close, were you not? Her brow tightened. We were professional acquaintances, yet you were in the habit of staying late. You left his home just an hour before he died. I was assisting with cataloging a manuscript for the Clarendon Archive. Ah, the Clarendon Archive. Poirot repeated, his gaze sliding to Lady Eugenia. A noble endeavor. Tell me, Lady Eugenia, how do you usually acquire your pieces? Donations, mostly, she replied coldly, and occasionally purchases from vetted dealers, and De Vries had vetted something for you recently. She didn't blink. Yes, a collection of 17th century pamphlets. May I ask if that included a Prussian tract concerning the metaphysics of mind? Eugenia's fingers clutched the head of her cane. It did, but it was deemed fraudulent. Poirot nodded. Forgive me for pressing. I merely seek to determine whether that manuscript still exists. Wynn's face darkened. Estelle, without speaking, opened the folio she had brought and removed a document encased in a clear sleeve. I believe this is what you're referring to. Poirot stepped forward and gently took it. His eyes scanned the lines with deliberate slowness. The forgery, he said. Estelle spoke softly. I took it after Julian's death. I didn't want the police to destroy it before it could be studied. It's a masterful fake, worthy of being preserved as an example. And were you the only one who knew where it was kept? No, she said. Julian told me, but also Lady Eugenia, and I suspect Anthony too. The room fell into a brief silence. Poirot turned toward the fireplace again. So, we return to our question. A forgery, yes. A threat of exposure. But Julian de Vries did not die because of this document alone. He died because someone feared the collapse of something greater than reputation. He faced them fully, and the signal, the flickering lamp, that, Mzamas, was a call, a code, perhaps even to confirm, it is done. The signal was known not just by the killer but by the accomplice. He paused, letting his words hang in the heavy morning air. But what if the accomplice never intended murder? What if they were drawn into something darker than they agreed to? Lady Eugenia stood. This is quite enough. If you have something to say, Monsieur Poirot, say it plainly. Poirot's gaze locked onto her with eerie stillness. Very well, I shall. But not here, tonight, at 10 o'clock. Under the lamp, Chapter 8, Beneath the lamp's shadow. The clock struck 10 with a heavy, deliberate clang. Montford Crescent stood bathed in a silver wash of moonlight, interrupted only by the subtle hum of the newly repaired street lamp. It glowed steady now, no flicker, no falter. Yet to those who had gathered in the street beneath its tall frame, the stillness carried an invisible charge. Poirot stood at the center of the crescent, his silhouette defined against the warm lamplight. The assembled guests, Estelle Whitcomb, Anthony Wynne, Lady Eugenia Clarendon, and Superintendent Jarvis formed a loose ring around him. All had arrived as requested, none without hesitation, even among them. None dared ask why they had been summoned. Poirot's tone that morning had made it clear. Answers were imminent, and alibis were running thin. Mzamas, Poirot began, his voice low but firm. This lamp has seen much. It is not merely a source of light, but a marker, a fixed point around which shadows have danced, lies have shifted, and one terrible act has taken place. Anthony shifted uneasily, his breath fogging in the night air. Why bring us here? Poirot turned to him with a quiet look. Because, Monsieur Wynne, the final truth must be revealed not in a drawing room or police station, but here, where it happened, where the signal was given, where the accomplice waited. Jarvis moved forward slightly. Poirot, are you certain? Oui. But permit me to recount, for clarity. He paced slowly, measuring steps crunching against the gravel. Julian de Vries was not murdered for money, nor for revenge. He was killed to protect a falsehood. A forgery, yes, but not just of paper. A forgery of identity, of provenance, of legacy. His eyes flicked to Lady Eugenia. You, madam, had your reputation to uphold. Your gallery depends on scholarly credibility. But de Vries had discovered inconsistencies. He threatened to publish his findings. Eugenia's chin lifted. He had no proof, Poe, but he did. He documented every contradiction. He found records of documents misattributed, purchases laundered through minor houses, dates that contradicted previous exhibitions. It would have ruined you. I had nothing to do with his death, she snapped. None. You did not kill him, but you did seek to silence him through persuasion, perhaps even blackmail. You were not alone. Poirot turned toward Estelle. Miss Whitcomb, you knew of Julian's discoveries. You admired him, perhaps more than you cared to admit, but you also knew he kept his findings in a hidden drawer discovered only after his death. Estelle said nothing. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, gave nothing away. Poirot continued, but the most critical player in this tale is not the forger, nor the critic, but the intermediary, the one who stood between Julian and his enemy, the messenger who carried the threat, the one who knew about the lamp. He turned slowly to Anthony Wynne. Wynne paled, his hands balling into fists. I've told you I had nothing to do with any of it. Ah, but your name, monsieur, appears in a curious letter Julian Lufton sent. In it, he accuses you of delivering veiled threats on Lady Eugenia's behalf, that you warned him he was tampering with things beyond his domain. Wynne's voice cracked. He was exaggerating. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And yet, you were the only one present the night before the body was found. You claimed you left early, but the gate was unlocked from within. Julian let you in? Yes, but did he let you leave? I left him alive, Wynne said quickly. He was brooding over his notes, that's all. Poirot nodded. And yet, just hours later, he was dead. No sign of forced entry. No struggle. A clean wound. Surgical, even. A crime committed by someone he trusted, or someone who returned after pretending to leave. Jarvis stepped closer. Are you accusing Mr. Wynne of the murder, Poirot? Poirot paused. Not quite. A beat of silence. Then Poirot's voice dropped. There's another layer. He turned again to Estelle. You, mademoiselle, took the manuscript, but not to protect Julian. You took it because you knew it had caused his death. You wanted to keep the evidence close, to control the narrative. You feared the police would not understand. Estelle's jaw tensed. You think I murdered him? No, Poirot said gently. I think you were the accomplice. You knew of the lamp signal. You watched from your window, the same way you did tonight. You were to receive a signal one flicker if the deed was done. But you never imagined it would end in death. Estelle's silence was confirmation enough. Jarvis narrowed his gaze. Then who wielded the knife? Poirot turned back to Anthony Wynne. He did. In a moment of desperation, Julian was going to expose him to his complicity in laundering documents through minor dealers. Wynne's debts were mounting. He had gambled away a small inheritance, and Julian, ever the purist, had no tolerance for deceit. Anthony collapsed onto the bench beside the lamp, head in his hands. I just meant to frighten him, he muttered, but he wouldn't stop talking. He said he'd already informed the committee, that I'd be banned from every house of antiquity in England. I didn't mean to. Poirot raised a hand. Enough. The lamp above flickered, once just a glitch of circuitry, but to the silent figures beneath it, it felt like a curtain falling on a stage well played. Superintendent, Poirot said softly, you may take them in. Jarvis signaled the waiting constables. Estelle offered no resistance. Anthony went quietly, face slack, eyes hollow. Poirot remained beneath the lamp long after they were gone, gazing up at its glow, a false light. He whispered to himself, but in the end, even shadows can betray their master. Chapter 9. What the drawer still held, the small flat of Julian de Vries stood untouched, since the day of his death, sealed by the police, studied in photographs, combed for fingerprints, and yet, curiously, still echoing with secrets. Superintendent Jarvis had offered Poirot a final visit to the scene now that Anthony Wynne and Estelle Whitcomb were both in custody, but Poirot had not come to gloat or confirm. He had come, as always, to finish. The evening rain pattered faintly against the windows as Poirot stepped through the door. His gait careful, almost reverent, he removed his gloves and walked to the writing desk where De Vries had spent his final hours. The police had catalogued every object on its fountain pens. A letter opener, a cracked spectacles case, and a small brass key left in the ink tray. It was the key that still intrigued Poirot. He sat quietly, adjusting the green-shaded lamp so it threw a steady glow upon the desk's surface. His fingers traced the wood grain thoughtfully. Then he reached under the main drawer, not to open it in the usual way, but to test the small underside panel Julian had modified. A false floor. The fingerprints on the exterior had been wiped, but Poirot had long suspected that De Vries, ever cautious, would keep his most damning evidence in the least conspicuous place. With a deft press and twist of the brass key, the drawer's hidden panel slid aside. There it was, a leather-bound notebook, its edges worn and brittle. Poirot retrieved it slowly, his gloved fingers careful not to smudge or tear the aging pages. The title was written in Julian's sharp, angular hand, Fabrications in Provenance, a decade of silent corruption. He opened it. Every page detailed a specific transaction dates, galleries, dealer names, falsified documentation, and most damning of all, a list of paintings cross-referenced with falsified artists' letters. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he saw names he recognized from recent society auctions and museum bequests. The trail was wide, but there, in the margins, was the name he had quietly hoped and feared to find: Clarendon. Not Lady Eugenia alone, but her brother, Lord Thomas Clarendon, chairman of a major London auction house. His name appeared next to at least 5 forged transfers, and in one case, a direct payment made to a J.D.W. Anthony Wynne's initials. Poirot sat back. The picture was wider than he had first seen. Estelle had taken the manuscript fearing the gallery's destruction, but she hadn't understood the depth of the conspiracy. Julian's murder had not been about pride or artistic rivalry. It had been about protecting an enterprise. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. It was Jarvis. "Well, Poirot?" the superintendent asked, glancing toward the desk. "Come to tie up loose ends?" Poirot nodded. "Indeed. And in doing so, I believe we must widen our investigation." He gestured to the open notebook. "This is no mere academic's diary. It is a ledger sheet of duplicity." Julian De Vries discovered not only the individual forgeries, he found the mechanism, a network of compromised experts, dealers, and historians, people who built reputations on false foundations. Jarvis moved closer, squinting at the pages. "Clarendon. Good Lord, that's a name you don't touch lightly." "No," Poirot agreed. "And that is precisely why Julian had to die. But Wynne did it." "Yes," Poirot said, eyes grave. "Wynne wielded the knife. But who ensured his silence before and after? Who stood to lose the most if Julian's work saw daylight? Why was the signal system in place at all? Estelle didn't invent it. She was instructed. A pawn in a great arrangement." Jarvis exhaled heavily. "You think this goes higher?" "I know it." Poirot rose and closed the notebook gently. "I believe Estelle feared scandal, not murder. But someone else ensured murder was the only resolution. Someone who knew Wynne's desperation, who needed this risk removed without involving themselves directly." Jarvis frowned. "Eugenia Clarendon?" Poirot shook his head slowly. "No, I suspect she was under pressure too. Prideful, yes, but not murderous, and not orchestrating Wynne's panic. This was someone with more to protect than reputation alone. Someone who would know when Estelle looked out the window, who would know which drawer Julian had started to hide his findings in, and who would let Anthony Wynne take the fall." Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper. "We must speak with Lord Clarendon." Jarvis looked uneasy. "He's a pillar of the art world. What if he denies everything?" "He will," Poirot said without hesitation. "But we do not need confession. We have this." He held up the notebook, and a record of a transfer dated 2 weeks before Julian's death. A forged Caravaggio sold under false provenance, with Wynne as intermediary, and the receipt signed by an associate of Lord Clarendon. Jarvis took the book from him like a sacred object. "We'll move carefully," the superintendent said. "Quietly. I'll have our fraud unit review the signatures and financials." Poirot gave a small nod. "Yes, but remember, this is no longer about one man's death. It is about an empire of lies." He turned once more toward the desk and gently slid the drawer closed. "And, as always," Poirot added quietly, "where there is shadow, there is light. Eventually, the rain continued outside, but in the stillness of Julian's study, one final truth had flickered into being. Chapter 10. A Gallery of Ghosts. Clarendon Gallery, perched on the edge of Piccadilly, was a place of marble hush and quiet grandeur, more cathedral than showroom. By early afternoon, it was nearly empty save for a silent security guard and a woman behind a rosewood counter, who glanced up only briefly as Hercule Poirot entered. He walked slowly, umbrella in hand, his eyes drifting not to the paintings, but to the reflections in the polished floors, to the shadows that clung to the gallery corners like old memories. Lord Thomas Clarendon, tall and silver-haired, was waiting near the central exhibit, a Flemish triptych flanked by muted spotlights. He turned as Poirot approached, extending a hand that trembled ever so slightly. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, voice cultured but brittle, "I understand you asked for this meeting." "Merci, Lord Clarendon," Poirot said, tilting his head. "It is most gracious of you. I prefer quiet places for delicate conversations." Clarendon gestured to a nearby bench. "We can speak here. This section is closed for rotation." Poirot sat, crossing his legs carefully. "It is about Julian de Vries." A pause. Clarendon did not blink. "You knew him, of course," Poirot continued gently. "Your gallery handled many of the same pieces he authenticated. I wonder, were you aware of the private journal he kept, one that contained meticulous records of provenance, discrepancies, and falsified documentation?" "I've heard rumors," Clarendon said coolly. "De Vries made enemies. He was never fond of the traditional market. Saw himself as a reformer." Poirot nodded. "Yes, indeed. A man of convictions. Dangerous ones, perhaps, to those whose fortunes depend on a certain opacity." Clarendon's gaze hardened. "Do you have a question, Monsieur Poirot?" "I have many, but I will ask only one for now. Why did Anthony Wynne murder Julian de Vries?" The older man blinked slowly. "Isn't that a matter for the courts? But courts examine only the blade, mon ami. I seek the hand behind the blade and the mind behind the hand." Clarendon folded his arms. "You believe I am that mind? I believe you are a man who has worked hard to shield your family name from disgrace," Poirot said softly, "perhaps even from collapse. And I believe you used Anthony Wynne to tidy away the dangerous nuisance that de Vries had become. But you underestimated the reach of a man's conscience." A flicker passed across Clarendon's face. Was it weariness? "Fury, you're speaking in abstractions," he said finally. "Suppositions." Poirot reached into his coat and withdrew the leather-bound notebook, carefully wrapped in tissue. "Then allow me to speak in specifics," he said. "Here's an entry. A painting by Alonso Cano authenticated under a forged chain of ownership. Sold through a small Madrid house, then resold here for 6 figures. The Madrid intermediary is linked to Wynne, and your signature appears approving its final acquisition for Clarendon's private collection." Clarendon did not reach for the book. He only stared at it. "De Vries never would have made that public," he said quietly. "No." Poirot agreed. "Because he did not get the chance." Clarendon turned his face slightly, as though regarding an invisible canvas on the far wall. "Wynne was pathetic," he said after a moment. "Brilliant eye, but no spine. Estelle used him, pushed him. Julian broke him." Poirot tilted his head. You make it sound like everyone but yourself held the knife. Clarendon's jaw clenched. I gave Wynne nothing but a warning, a plea to delay publication. I knew what the fallout would be. That journal is a death sentence to half the international market. Poirot's voice softened. And you did not consider what it might mean to DeVries? Clarendon looked away. I didn't order anything. I didn't even know Wynne still had access to DeVries' flat. He was meant to leave, to vanish. I offered him a ticket to Lisbon, money. Poirot's brow lifted, and yet he stayed. Because he believed Estelle still loved him. Because he thought he could destroy the man who had taken her. Clarendon gave a tired, bitter smile. Love makes fools of us all. Poirot stood, returning the notebook to his coat. I shall give this to the authorities, Lord Clarendon. Your name will appear in the inquiries to follow. I advise you to cooperate fully. The older man did not rise. Tell me, Poirot, he said quietly, do you truly believe justice is ever clean? That men like me vanish because one notebook sees daylight? Poirot regarded him, eyes unreadable. No, but I believe in the power of small truths to disturb large shadows. He turned to go, then paused. One more thing, he said over his shoulder. Julian DeVries named his file a gallery of ghosts. Perhaps he knew that no one truly disappears. They linger in ledgers, in gilt, in ink. Clarendon said nothing. Poirot walked away, the echo of his shoes merging with the sigh of air from the vents. Outside, the flickering street lamp across from the gallery sputtered once more to life. The ghosts, it seemed, had not yet finished speaking. Chapter 11. The man from Lisbon's drizzle had grown into a steadier, chillier rain by the time Hercule Poirot stepped out of the Clarendon gallery. A pale mist clung to the narrow streets like ghostly lace, softening the corners of parked cars and lamp-posts, making everything seem a little too quiet. He did not open his umbrella. His mind was too occupied. A gallery of ghosts. He repeated the phrase silently, as though rolling a rare coin between his fingers. The journal had indeed contained ghosts of paintings long lost, of names hidden behind shell buyers, and of transactions that bore the unmistakable stench of laundering and fraud. But as was often the case, it was not the ghost itself that posed the danger, but the one who tried to bury it. When Poirot returned to his flat, he found Inspector Japp already waiting in the drawing room, head in lap, eyes squinting at the ashtray on Poirot's coffee table. You don't smoke, Japp muttered. None, said Poirot, removing his coat. But Estelle DeVries does. Turkish cigarettes, with a gold paper wrap. 'Twas distinctive. Japp raised an eyebrow. She been here? She left that earlier this week when she came to plead for my discretion. Japp whistled. That woman's nerve. Poirot poured them both tea, slow and deliberate. Japp, you remember a man named Fernando Luz? Japp frowned. Lisbon dealer. Black market specialist during the war. Vanished 5 years ago. Why? Poirot tapped his fingers together. Because he was the intermediary Julian DeVries named in his journal. The one who facilitated the fake Cano sale. He used the alias R. Santos on the documentation. Japp sat up straighter. You're saying the Clarendon Gallery laundered a forgery through him? I am saying, Poirot replied, that Lord Clarendon turned a blind eye to provenance because his coffers were bleeding. And when young, desperate Wynne was caught between his employer and his lover. Estelle, who once modeled for DeVries, introduced him to Luz under the pretense of sourcing quiet acquisitions from Spain. And what did DeVries know? Poirot sipped his tea. Too much. He was preparing to expose the false attributions, the ghost buyers. He believed that if he could bring down Clarendon, Estelle would return to him having been freed from Wynne's toxic grasp. Japp snorted. Romantic nonsense. None, Poirot said softly. Tragic nonsense. But he was close. Perhaps too close. The phone rang sharply from the corner. Poirot rose to answer it, listening with a furrowed brow. Merci, he said at last. We shall come immediately. He turned to Jap. That was customs. A man matching Luz's description was detained arriving from Lisbon this morning. False passport. An anonymous tip led them to search his bags. Guess what they found? Jap's eyes narrowed. Let me guess. A painting? Mesui, Poirot said with satisfaction. A 17th century Spanish piece with Clarendon's gallery seal, listed as stolen 3 years ago. The very painting Wynne once appraised under Estelle's supervision. The small interrogation room at Scotland Yard smelled faintly of lemon oil and mildew. Fernando Luz or Santos, as his forged documents claimed, sat with the air of someone used to pressure, but dismayed by its source. His fingers fidgeted along the grain of the wooden table. Poirot studied the man for a long moment before speaking. He was lean, olive-skinned, with eyes like burnt copper. His suit was ill-fitted, worn at the cuffs. You came back, Poirot said gently. Why? Luz gave a crooked smile. Because London always pays, even after Julian de Vries. Luz's smile faded. De Vries was a fool. He thought he could threaten me. But I never touched him. You are not the only one who says that, Poirot murmured. Yet you fled the day after his death. I had reason to. Wynne warned me, said the police would start sniffing around. Wynne? Why would he protect you? Luz hesitated. Because he was still trying to protect her. Estelle, he loved her. Poirot leaned in. Did she love him? Luz's laugh was harsh and hollow. She loved whatever man helped her climb the next rung. De Vries, then Wynne, probably Clarendon next. She brokered every deal we ever made. She found the buyers. She forged some of the certificates herself. You think she's just some widow in pearls? Jap crossed his arms. You've got no proof. But Poirot's eyes had gone still. Not yet, he said. But we have a trail. Luz looked between them, realization dawning too late. You don't need me to confess. You've already got what you need. Poirot gave a small, sad smile. You are merely another ghost in the gallery. That evening, Poirot sat alone in his flat, going through the last pages of de Vries's journal. He turned to a dog-eared sketch tucked in the back, Estelle's profile in soft pencil. Her eyes were shaded dark, not with malice, but mystery. The kind of mystery that swallowed men whole. Poirot sighed. Tomorrow, he murmured, we will confront the final portrait. Chapter 12. Estelle's last canvassed morning arrived brittle and silver-hued, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Outside, the mist clung stubbornly to the railings of buildings, like old secrets that refused to drift away. In Hercule Poirot's apartment, the small fire crackled in the grate, untouched tea cooling on a saucer as he stood before the tall window, watching the city blur beneath the fog. He did not like ugliness, especially not the kind born from betrayal. A soft knock interrupted his reverie. He turned. Miss Lemon entered with quiet urgency. Madame Estelle de Vries has arrived. She insists it's personal. Poirot gave a short nod. Show her in, if you please. Estelle swept into the room like a shadow, composed, elegant, gloved in ivory leather. There was no trace of grief on her painted features, only an icy defiance tempered by careful charm. Bonjour, Monsieur Poirot, she said, her voice like glass under pressure. He gestured toward the chair. Please, madam, let us not dance today. She did not sit. I assume, she said coolly, this is about Fernando Luz. Ah, Poirot murmured, clasping his hands behind his back. So we have abandoned pretense. I heard he was arrested. But if you're expecting me to defend him, you're wasting your time. Curious, Poirot said, his eyes narrowing, for a woman who introduced him to both her husband and to Mr. Wynne. Estelle's fingers tightened around the handle of her handbag. That was business. Julian knew the risks. So did Wynne. Poirot stepped closer. You forged certificates of authenticity for at least for paintings now traced back to Luz. You coordinated their exhibition at Clarendon. You even advised Lord Clarendon to insure them for more than their true value. And now Luz has returned with one of those paintings, declaring it was you who commissioned the smuggling. She scoffed, but her expression faltered. Luz is a criminal. He would say anything to save himself. He may be a criminal, Poirot agreed. But so far, everything he has said matches what I have uncovered, including the existence of a fifth painting enlisted, undocumented, and delivered not to the gallery, but to your private residence in Knightsbridge. There was a flicker in her gaze just a moment, but Poirot saw it. I have no such painting. She said. You did, he replied softly, until 3 nights ago, when you quietly transferred it to the care of an antique dealer in Pimlico. Under your maiden name. Estelle sat, slowly, her breath escaping like steam from a cracked kettle. Do you think this is what Julian would have wanted? She asked, voice lowered. He was drowning, Monsieur Poirot. You saw it. His work was no longer fashionable. He clung to his past and to his brushes like a man clutching the railing of a sinking ship. He needed me to save him. Poirot studied her. So you sold his name to fund your salvation? I gave him relevance, she hissed. I arranged for exhibitions, buyers, and interest. Do you know how hard it is to keep a dying artist's name alive? What I built was to protect him, to protect his legacy, even if that meant laundering a few truths. Poirot's voice, when he answered, was calm and cold, and when he threatened to expose those truths, she looked away. You see, madam, Poirot said, stepping lightly round the chair, Julian de Vries was murdered because he believed love could save him. He wrote of it in his journal, in phrases soaked in desperation. He believed if he brought down the fraud, you would forgive him for letting your affair with Wynne rot under the surface. But love, madam, is not built on blackmail. Estelle's voice trembled. I didn't kill him, but you knew who did. There was a long silence. The fire hissed. She reached into her handbag, pulled out a slim envelope, and placed it on the table. Poirot took it gently. Inside were photographs, grainy, shot from a distance, but unmistakable. A man at the de Vries cottage, entering late at night, leaving alone. Wynne, Poirot murmured. Not Julian's last visitor, but his killer. Estelle nodded, her voice barely audible. He didn't mean to. Julian called him, asked to meet. He wanted to confess. But Wynne panicked. He always panicked. Poirot raised an eyebrow. And yet you protected him. I thought if I could hold him steady, he'd keep the gallery afloat. He needed me. I needed him. To keep the walls from falling in. Poirot stepped away. The case was crystallizing now, each shard of motive action, and consequence finding its rightful place. I must go, Estelle said, rising with brittle poise. I'll expect your visit later, no doubt with Inspector Japp in tow. Poirot gave a gentle nod. There are still truths to face. As she reached the door, Poirot called out softly. One more question, madam. Why did you keep the fifth painting? Estelle paused, hand on the knob. Her voice floated back like a sigh. Because Julian painted it. The night before he died. He called it La Trahison. The betrayal. And with that, she was gone. Poirot stood in silence. Some crimes, he thought, are painted not with blood but with brush strokes of longing, desperation, and ruin. Chapter 1-3. The betrayal. Unfamed fog outside had begun to recede by the time Hercule Poirot arrived at the Pimlico antique shop. It was a narrow little place tucked between a laundrette and an herbalist's apothecary, almost invisible unless one was looking for it. The brass sign above the door read Thistle and Vine, its lettering curling in faded elegance. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and thyme. Clocks ticked out of sync. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen fireworks, and curiosities littered every shelf. Behind the glass counter, a stooped man with a hawkish nose and sharp blue eyes looked up from polishing a candlestick. Good morning, Poirot said, doffing his hat. You are Mr. Dredge. The man nodded warily. You the one called ahead, asking about the De Vries piece? Poirot smiled. Indeed. I am Hercule Poirot. I believe you acquired a certain painting under a pseudonym just a few days ago? Dredge's eyes narrowed. I don't deal in stolen art. None. Nor do I accuse you. The transaction was not criminal on your part, merely concealed. With a grunt, Dredge moved from behind the counter and led Poirot to a locked back room. He opened the door and gestured toward a canvas propped against the wall. Still wrapped in brown paper, the corners marked with faint traces of red wax, Poirot approached reverently. He peeled back the paper to reveal the final painting of Julian de Vries. It was unlike the others, more intimate, more haunted. The style was unmistakably de Vries, but stripped of pretense. In the center stood three human figures in a collapsing studio. One, a painter, hunched and gray-faced, grasped a canvas in one hand, while with the other he reached toward a woman draped in silver robes, her eyes turned away. Behind her, a third figure held a brush dipped in shadow, painting over the first man's work with long, black strokes. It was not subtle. La Trazen. Poirot whispered. He painted this knowing he would not survive the week. Dredge shrugged, unimpressed. Bit dramatic, if you ask me. Poirot didn't answer. His eyes lingered on the detail, the barely visible tear on the painter's cheek, the studio's fractured window. The glint of a ring dropped on the floor, symbols layered with aching precision. Julian de Vries had told the truth the only way he could. Later, as Poirot stepped out onto the street, he found Inspector Japp waiting beside a constable, arms folded, breath misting in the air. Thought I'd find you here, Japp said. We've picked up Win. Poirot raised an eyebrow. You did not wait for my word. We were waiting for confirmation, Japp replied, and Estelle de Vries delivered it in person. Marched right into Scotland Yard with photographs, financial records, and a list of every forged certificate she helped produce. Turned the whole scheme upside down. Poirot's mustache twitched with interest. She did not implicate herself further. Oh, she did, Japp said grimly. Says she's willing to face the consequences. Fraud, obstruction, accessory after the fact. She knew Wynne killed her husband. Knew and covered for him. Poirot nodded slowly. She believed she could control him, that her influence would protect her. But betrayal, mon ami, is like a canvas left in the rain. It always shows through in time. They walked together toward the car, boots echoing along the pavement. What I don't understand, Japp muttered, is why Wynne did it. The man had everything: money, prestige, a gallery about to launch internationally. Poirot's voice was quiet. He saw it unraveling. Julian was prepared to confess, to destroy the entire house of cards. Wynne panicked. He went to the cottage that night to confront Julian, perhaps to scare him. But the fear turned to rage, and rage, Chief Inspector, is never content with silence. It must take something. Poor devil, Japp said, shaking his head. Still had his brushes in his hand, they say. Poirot gave a sad smile. He died an artist. Even in despair, they drove in silence to Clarendon Gallery. Though closed for the day, its great iron gates stood open, as if waiting for closure. Inside, Poirot wandered through the hanging exhibits, past bold splashes of color and calculated shadows, until he found the small private room reserved for donors and collectors. There, boxed and created, were the remaining forged paintings. Poirot traced his gloved fingers along the edges. These were the relics of ambition gone awry, of a woman who had tried to elevate a legacy by burying it beneath fraud, of a man who had mistaken fear for loyalty, and of another whose only crime was hoping truth would matter more than appearance. He found the small guestbook on a nearby pedestal. He took the gallery's fountain pen and signed his name. Below it, in neat script, he wrote, in art, "The truth is always present, whether in pigment or absence. HP as he returned the pen to its place. He heard the unmistakable creak of the front door opening. Miss Lemon entered, wrapped in her Primwell coat, a brown envelope tucked under her arm. "I thought you might be here," she said. From Scotland Yard, Estelle's full confession and a preliminary statement from Luz. "Jap thought you'd want copies." Poirot accepted the envelope with a nod. "Merci, Miss Lemon. There is one final matter to settle." She tilted her head. He looked toward the window, where the light had finally broken through the morning mist. "The painting," he said. "La Trahison. It must be returned to its rightful place, not hidden in the back room of a shop, but displayed where it can speak. Let it say what Julian never could." Miss Lemon gave a faint, respectful smile. "I'll see to it." As Poirot stood once more among the fractured legacy of the De Vries name, he allowed himself a single thought. Some truths need not be shouted. They need only to be painted and seen. Chapter 1. For a brush with remorse. The afternoon waned into a pewter-gray dusk, shadows lengthening across the Clarendon Gallery. As Poirot returned to his flat on Whitehaven Mansions, he sat by the fire. The confession papers Estelle had signed now carefully arranged before him on the small Art Deco table. The handwriting was refined, graceful, almost detached, as though it were a letter to an old friend, not a sworn admission of complicity in forgery and deceit. Miss Lemon entered with her usual efficient composure, bearing a silver tray of tea and lemon biscuits. She placed it beside him wordlessly and took a seat by the small bookshelf, eyes flitting over the headlines of the evening paper. "It's on the front page," she murmured. "Win Barrow in custody. Estelle de Vries cooperating." Scotland Yard was swarmed by reporters. Poirot stirred his tea with absent-minded precision, as they would swarm around a wounded beast. It is their nature. But the true interest, Miss Lemon, lies not in the headlines but in the margins. He tapped the confession lightly. "She begins with regret," he said. "Not guilty. That distinction tells us much." Miss Lemon looked up. "She doesn't regret the forgeries, monsieur?" "None. She regrets that they were uncovered." Estelle viewed herself not as a criminal, but as a curator of legacy. She believed Julian's decline was a betrayal of his genius, and she took it upon herself to protect what he once was. Miss Lemon hesitated. "Do you think she ever loved him?" Poirot paused, then gave a sad smile. "In her way, yes, but not the man. She loved the myth, the artist. When the myth began to crack, she patched it with gold leaf and deception." He glanced toward the case file Jap had sent. Inside was a statement from Luz Fenwick the quiet, sharp-eyed assistant who had seen more than she had ever spoken. "Miss Fenwick confirms what I suspected," Poirot said. "She witnessed Estelle meeting Win Barrow on at least 4 occasions. Over the past year, always in secret. She assumed they were romantically involved." Miss Lemon blinked. "Were they?" Poirot shook his head. "Ah, no. That is the beautiful misdirection of it, non. It was not passion that bound them, but necessity. Estelle needed a forger. Win needed a patron to protect his floundering gallery from collapse." Miss Lemon said nothing. The fire cracked softly. In the silence, Poirot's gaze drifted to the window, where the flickering street lamp so often overlooked cast its hesitant glow once more. On the fog-slick cobblestones, a street lamp that flickers, he said suddenly, does not do so at random. There is a cause, a faulty wire, a power surge. Likewise, in this case, the inconsistencies, the silences, the shifting loyalties, they were the flickers. All I needed to do was follow the current. He rose from his chair and began to pace. Julian knew. He knew he had become obsolete in the eyes of those around him. His students thought him mad. His wife thought him a relic. And yet he painted La Trahison, with trembling hands, perhaps, but clarity of mind. It was his final defiance. Poirot's eyes sharpened. "But what still troubles me, Miss Lemon, is the matter of the ring." "The ring?" she echoed. the signet ring found on the floor in the painting clearly rendered, yet never mentioned by the family or found among Julian's belongings. Miss Lemon frowned. Could it be a metaphor? Non, Poirot said, stopping short. Julian was not a man of symbols for their own sake. He painted with purpose. He bent down, retrieved the photograph of La Trahisson, and pointed to the ring. It is not Julian's, not Estelle's, but it resembles one I glimpsed once before on the finger of a certain collector. Miss Lemon blinked. You don't mean? Poirot nodded. Mr. Tobias Ashe, the wealthy collector who had so generously supported the Clarendon, who had hosted fundraisers in Estelle's name, and who had by chance or design profited immensely from the sale of the De Vries resurgence. But why would Julian paint his ring? Miss Lemon asked. Poirot tapped the photo. Because Tobias Ashe was the first to suspect the forgeries, and Julian knew. Ashe had confronted Estelle in private weeks before Julian's death, offering her a final chance to come clean. She refused. Then he backed away. Miss Lemon asked. Poirot gave a thin smile. He did more than that. He agreed to remain silent, in exchange for exclusive rights to purchase certain masterpieces at a fraction of their value. Quietly, discreetly. A man of his wealth does not need to expose scandal. He merely diverts it to his benefit. Miss Lemon looked faintly ill. Blackmail through silence. Just so. Poirot gently returned the photograph to the case file. Julian painted the ring as a final condemnation not only of those who betrayed him, but of the one who bartered truth for prestige. It was his way of signing a warning, a message for those with eyes to see. The fire crackled once more. Poirot folded his hands behind his back and gazed into it. Wynne is in custody. Estelle will answer for her role. But Tobias Ashe, he is untouched. No laws were broken by buying silence. And yet he, too, is stained. Miss Lemon, with uncharacteristic boldness, said, So what will you do? Poirot turned slowly, his eyes like tempered steel. I will pay Mr. Ashe a visit, not as an officer of the law but as a gentleman of conscience. Sometimes, Miss Lemon, justice does not need a courtroom. Sometimes it only requires the truth to be spoken aloud. Chapter 15. The collector's shadow next morning arrived like a curtain slowly drawn, fog melting off the London streets in reluctant wisps. Poirot, impeccably dressed in dove gray, made his way to the Belgravia residence of Mr. Tobias Ashe, a house that wore its wealth. Like a tailored overcoat, discreet, expensive, and free of ostentation. The butler, as colorless as the trim on the Georgian facade, ushered Poirot inside without resistance. Mr. Ashe is expecting you, he murmured, voice devoid of curiosity. Poirot followed the man into a library lined wall to wall with old leather spines and polished brass accents. Mr. Ashe stood by the window, the flicker of a cigar between his fingers. A large portrait of a 17th-century Flemish merchant loomed above the hearth, his expression as unreadable as the host's. Monsieur Poirot, Ashe said with that same voice, suave, practiced, and condescendingly amused. I wondered how long it would take for you to arrive. You flatter me, Poirot replied, removing his gloves one finger at a time. Though, truly, it was not a question of if, but of when. Ashe offered a seat. Poirot declined. He remained standing, his eyes trailing the frames along the far wall. Several bore pieces attributed to Julian de Vries' early works, original, undoubtedly authentic. I see you have a taste for legacy, Poirot said. I have a taste for permanence, Ashe replied. Most things in this world decay: reputation, talent, truth. But art endures. Poirot turned to face him. Art, yes, but only when it is real. Ashe's brow lifted. And yet so much of what is real depends upon what the buyer believes. Poirot gave a tiny, cold smile. Indeed. Which brings me to your belief in the authenticity of the recent De Vries rediscoveries. Ashe's smile did not flicker. They sold well, didn't they? Ah, but you never bought one. Not publicly, at least, and yet, your name appears on the intermediary paperwork holding companies, shell trusts, anonymous bidding arms. Ash walked to the bar and poured himself a splash of scotch. You've done your homework. I do more than homework, Monsieur Ash. I read between the lines. You knew, from the beginning. Ash leaned against the bar, swirling his drink. I suspected. You confronted Estelle. I offered her a way out. You offered her silence for a price. He sipped, unbothered. A business arrangement. Poirot stepped closer. A coward's arrangement. You could have exposed her. You could have saved Julian's legacy. But instead, you chose profit. Ash met his gaze. And what of it? Julian was a washed-up recluse. Estelle preserved his myth. Wynne executed her vision. I merely profited from their combined vanity. No one was hurt. No fortunes destroyed. Poirot's voice dropped, quiet and severe. Julian was hurt. He knew. La Trace in his final painting was not just an accusation. It was a eulogy, and you are in it. For the first time, Ash blinked. Poirot walked toward the portrait of the Flemish merchant. The ring, Mr. Ash, your ring. Your family crest embedded in the signet, there for all to see, if only they were looking. It was no accident. Julian painted you into the fraud forever. Ash said nothing. The scotch in his glass was suddenly less appealing. He set it down. You think I'll be arrested? He asked. Poirot shook his head. No, Scotland Yard has no interest in men who merely watch the fire burn. But I am interested in conscience. Ash laughed softly, bitterly. Conscience is for the poor, Monsieur Poirot. For those who cannot afford silence. Poirot stepped closer, his voice soft but resolute. You are mistaken. Conscience is not a luxury, it is the only currency that outlives wealth. Ash turned back to the window, staring into the thinning fog. So what now? A public scandal? A press release? Shall I throw myself into the Thames? Poirot's tone softened. Non, that is not my aim. But you will return the profits earned from these forged transactions to the De Vries Trust, quietly, anonymously, if you prefer, not to exonerate Estelle, but to restore the truth to Julian's name. Ash looked at him long and hard. And if I refuse? Poirot merely tapped the silver-tipped cane he'd brought, his expression unchanged. Then I publish La Trace in every major European paper, with an annotation detailing the meaning of the ring. You will be known, Monsieur Ash, not as a collector, not as a patron, but as a parasite. Silence fell. Only the crackle of the fireplace filled the void. At last, Ash turned away. Very well. I'll have my lawyers begin the process. Quietly, of course. Poirot inclined his head. Discretion, I agree, is sometimes the better servant of truth. He turned to leave. Pausing at the door, Tell me, Ash said, his voice distant, do you think Estelle ever loved him? Or was he just a stepping stone? Poirot paused. She loved the man he had been, but not enough to let him fade with dignity. That, perhaps, was the greater betrayal. Poirot left without another word. Stepping into the brightening morning, the fog giving way to sunlight and behind him. In the silent house, a collector stood alone, haunted not by ghosts, but by the portrait of his own compromise. Chapter 16. The truth hung in oil and shadow. The wind had picked up by late afternoon, sweeping through the narrow lanes of Chelsea like a painter's brush, blurring edges, shifting light, turning sharp details into murky watercolors. Hercule Poirot walked steadily, the cane he seldom used now clicking deliberately on the stone pavement. There was a peculiar gravity in his step as he made his way toward the De Vries estate, Julian's final sanctuary, now sealed off with caution tape and sorrow. Inspector Felton met him at the gate, looking decidedly more thoughtful than usual. We've finished the inventory, he said, motioning to a clipboard tucked under his arm. The studio's still a wreck, But the rest of the house, well, it's a shrine. Letters, journals, sketches, all untouched, Poirot said quietly. Then it is time to enter the shrine and speak to the dead. Felton raised an eyebrow but followed him through. The interior of the house was exactly as Julian had left it, cold, dim, and heavy with an artist's peculiar sense of eternity. They passed through a parlor littered with stained brushes and broken frames, until they reached the locked door to the private gallery. This was off limits to everyone, Felton said. Estelle said Julian hadn't let anyone in for years. Poirot took the key from the envelope given to him earlier by Estelle de Vries, slid it into the lock, and turned. The door creaked open. Inside, the gallery was draped in sheets, white like mourning veils. A soft draft fluttered one of them slightly, revealing a corner of a painting black and gold, thick with shadow. Poirot stepped in, letting the air of the room settle over him. He reached out and slowly pulled away the cloth, and there it was, La Trahisson, Julian de Vries' final painting. Felton gave a low whistle. Bloody hell! The canvas was enormous, nearly 6 feet tall, and a chaotic storm of emotion. At its center, a faceless man cradled a flame in his hands, light, fragile, and desperate, while behind him loomed figures cloaked in shadow. One bore a painter's palette, but its colors bled like tears. Another held a fountain pen that dripped ink into a pool of gold coins. And to the side, just barely visible, was a hand wearing a signet ring. Poirot gestured to it. The ring. The crest. Tobias Ashe. Felton nodded slowly. You were right. This painting is a confession and an accusation. Poirot circled the painting, stepping carefully over scattered tubes of oil and charcoal. Julian painted his despair, but also his clarity. This is not madness, it is a method. Look here, there is Estelle, veiled in red. Passion, deception, and their win. Clutching what looks like a contract, the ink still fresh. The inspector tilted his head. Then he knew. He knew they'd betrayed him. And yet, he did not stop them. He chose instead to immortalize the truth. They stood in silence for a moment before Felton spoke again. You really believe he took his own life, then? Poirot's face remained unreadable. I believe he chose his exit. Whether he swallowed despair or something more literal remains a matter for the coroner. But intent, that was clear. Felton walked toward the far corner of the gallery, where another canvas leaned backward against the wall, half covered by an old tarp. He pulled it back. Another painting, he murmured. Untitled. This one was different, gentler in tone, though no less haunting. A small boy stood in a field of golden wheat, a paintbrush in one hand, gazing up at a woman in the distance, whose face was blurred beyond recognition. Poirot stared for a long moment. A memory, perhaps his mother, or the muse he wished Estelle had been. Felton turned. You think he still loved her? None, Poirot said softly, but he loved what she once was. Before ambition clouded the air between them, as they turned to leave, Poirot paused at the doorway. There is one final thing I must see. They descended to the basement where Julian's original sketches had once been stored, a place no longer disturbed by time. Poirot rifled through several drawers, finally pulling out a flat, gray folder tied in red ribbon. Inside, dozens of studies, but one caught his eye, a rough penciled draft of La Trahisson. He studied it, noting the placement of figures, the symbolism taking root in early strokes, and then he saw something else, a signature, scrawled faintly in the margin, not Julian's, but Estelle's, along with notes, reverse palette, heightened contrast, add ring detail. Poirot's mouth thinned. So he whispered, she collaborated on this final work. Felton frowned, but she denied even seeing it. Poirot folded the sketch and placed it into his coat. She lied. But why lie about contributing to Julian's greatest work? Unless she feared being seen as the architect of his farewell? They climbed the stairs again, silence stretching between them. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting gold over the house, and the street lamp that stood just beyond the gate, the one that flickered faintly every evening. Poirot paused, looking up at it. Flickering, he said to himself. A signal, a warning, or a memorial. Felton looked confused. To what? Poirot didn't answer. Not yet, but in his mind, the pieces were aligning. One betrayal had been painted. Another still remained in shadow, and Hercule Poirot, keeper of symmetry, would not rest until every corner had been revealed to light. Chapter 17. Estelle's red ink. Poirot stood before the fire in his suite at the Belgravia Hotel, warming his hands while the evening rain spattered gently against the window. The sketch recovered from Julian's basement lay flat on the table behind him, pinned beneath a heavy book of poetry. The signature, faint but undeniable, Estelle's flourish in crimson pencil, haunted his thoughts. He turned to face Inspector Felton, who had returned after a short detour to Scotland Yard. You spoke with the gallery's accountant? Poirot asked. Felton nodded, tossing a small ledger onto the table. Just as you suspected. Several payments marked consultation went to Estelle under a pseudonym. E.V. Gray, started 2 years ago. 2 years, Poirot echoed. Coinciding with Julian's mental decline, she was guiding the brush, Felton added grimly, feeding him ideas, encouraging the paranoia, perhaps even knowing he would paint that final piece. Poirot's gaze darkened. But it is not only betrayal, it is orchestration. He picked up the sketch again. She planted motifs, gave notes, and even altered color direction. Estelle de Vries did not simply betray her husband. She curated his final madness. Felton exhaled slowly. But why deny it? She could have said she helped, claimed it was part of healing their artistic bond. Poirot lifted a finger, because to admit it would implicate her in the intention behind La Trahison. To acknowledge authorship of the painting is to admit she knew he was saying goodbye. The room fell quiet. Then Poirot continued, It is not a crime to drive a man to despair, but it is a motive. A motive? Felton's brows rose. For what? We agreed this was suicide. Poirot's eyes flicked toward the sketch once more. No, mon ami. We assumed it, but I now believe Julian de Vries was murdered. The flickering street lamp, the red ink signature, the change in tone of the final letter all point not to resignation, but resistance. He discovered something. Felton's face tensed. You think he found out Estelle and Tobias Ashe were planning something more than a gallery? Poirot folded his hands neatly. A new legacy, built on his ashes. But perhaps he decided not to give them what they wanted. Perhaps he was about to expose them, and that is when the shadows struck. He paced to the window. She did not cry at the funeral, Poirot murmured, and Tobias was too eager to host a retrospective. We must move carefully now. Felton nodded, silent. Poirot turned back to him, the fire casting sharp lines across his face. Bring me the autopsy results. And summon Estelle. Felton's voice was low. You're calling her bluff? Poirot's smile was faint, but resolute. Non, I am lighting the last candle in the gallery. If she stands in shadow, it is because she has something to hide. Chapter 18. The candle in the gallery. It was past 10 o'clock when the doors to the Estelle and Ashe Gallery opened for its final night viewing. A hushed, respectful crowd drifted between the canvases, whispering as they studied the tortured brushwork of La Trahison. The painting loomed in its alcove, lit by a single amber spotlight, the red seeming to bleed from its edges. Estelle stood at the far end of the gallery, wrapped in a silk shawl, speaking in hushed tones to Tobias Ashe. Her posture was regal. She gave no hint of unease until Hercule Poirot entered. He moved slowly, his eyes taking in every detail. By his side was Inspector Felton, face grave, the official folder tucked beneath his arm. Estelle caught sight of them. For the first time, her mask faltered. Poirot approached La Trace and stood in front of it, arms folded behind his back. The gathering noticed his presence. Silence rippled outward, like concentric circles from a single drop of ink. Finally, he turned to face them all. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began. "Forgive the interruption. I know this is meant to be an evening of mourning, but perhaps it is more fitting to end it as an evening of truth." A murmur rose. Estelle's face froze. Poirot gestured gently toward the painting. "This canvas, as many of you know, is believed to be Julian de Vries's final statement, a descent into madness, a suicide note in oil and shadow. But it is none of these things." The crowd stiffened. "This painting," Poirot continued, "was not created in isolation. It was guided step by the hand of another." He turned his gaze directly toward Estelle. "By you, madam." Estelle did not speak. Poirot walked slowly as he spoke, weaving between the guests. "We discovered sketches annotated in your hand, payments made under a false name. And then, most telling of all, this." He held up a glass slide of the original sketch discovered in Julian's basement, now magnified, and projected onto the wall behind him. There it was, the same chaotic shapes, the same spattered despair. But in the corner, unmistakable, the red signature, E. de Vries. Estelle's lips parted, just slightly. Poirot did not stop. "You claim to retreat from art, but instead, you orchestrated your husband's return to it. Not for his healing, no, for your own ambition. And when he realized it, when he tried to remove his name from the gallery and void the transfer of his works, you panicked." Tobias Ash stepped forward, face pale. "Now hold on." Poirot raised a hand. "You, monsieur, helped cover her tracks. You paid off the courier who delivered Julian's unsigned letter to the newspapers. You deleted the last entries from his electronic journals. But the body does not lie." He turned to Felton, who opened the folder. "Julian de Vries died not from falling, but from a fast-acting neurotoxin introduced through a shallow puncture on his upper arm. Someone gave him tea that night, someone who knew how to slip in just enough to mimic collapse." The guests gasped. A woman near the back stifled a cry. Poirot fixed his eyes on Estelle. "It was not grief that made you distant at his funeral, madam. It was controlled. You thought the art would eclipse the man. You thought no one would ask why his last note had no date, no title. You underestimated the order of Hercule Poirot." Estelle's voice, when it came, was low, trembling not with sorrow, but anger. "You don't understand. He wanted to burn everything he'd built. He wanted to erase his legacy because of some illness in his soul. I preserved him. I made him immortal." Poirot's voice was quiet. "Non, madam. You made him silent." A beat of silence hung heavy. Felton stepped forward. "Estelle de Vries, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Julian de Vries." Estelle didn't resist. She stood tall, as if already sculpting her next persona. Tobias Ash shrank away, eyes wide, sweat beading his temple as the officers escorted Estelle away. The guests slowly turned back to the painting. It now bore a different or less mystique, more mourning. Poirot remained behind, gazing at La Trace. He approached it alone and leaned in close. "In the end," he murmured, "your final act was not your painting, Monsieur de Vries. It was your resistance. The red ink, the sketch, the unfinished letter. You lit just enough of the truth to be seen if one looked closely." He straightened his cuffs and turned to leave. Felton caught up with him outside. "You ever thought of painting, Poirot?" Poirot lifted a brow. "Ah, non. My art is elsewhere." They stepped into the London night. The gallery lights dimmed behind them, leaving only one burning faintly, a single candle above the doorway, flickering in the rain. A light for truth, and Poirot, as always, walked toward it.